That's fine. Okay. Thanks, Kirsty. So in 1889 and 1890, so for those of you who are watching this on the recording, you've missed very little, really. I'm talking about three different women writers of the same column in a newspaper, the Blackburn Standard. And the first one I'm looking at is byline Penelope, and this was brought in as a syndicated column. And Penelope was actually Phoebe Lancaster, the daughter of a Manchester mill owner. And she wrote on nature and botany for periodicals and also in books. And her writing increased after her husband's death in 1874. And she wrote on women's health, education and social issues in the Queen, Chambers' Journal and the Magazine of the Arts. But this weekly column for provincial papers, which she wrote for 20 years, was probably her most reliable source of income, although perhaps the least prestigious. Now, it was written in London and it radiated out to the provinces. And I'm trying to move you away from that idea that things went in that direction. But it's true, and in a way, the title of my book, A Fleet Street in Every Town, I'm nodding to the supremacy of London as a publishing centre for newspapers and definitely for periodicals. But I'm just trying to complicate the picture, really. And even from this syndication model, we can learn something important about the provincial press, that it operated as a national system through which material could very easily be distributed. And Lancaster used her column to promote women's causes, although she wasn't a radical. And here her column was published in a conservative paper. The Blackburn Standard was partly funded by the Conservative Association in Blackburn. But not all the provincial press was conservative, even with a small c, or reactionary or middle of the road. And the other point I'd want to make from this is we can't rely only on what appears in the newspaper. There's much more to, as we know, there's much more to a periodical than what we see in the text. And all I'm saying is the same thing applies to these scratchy little provincial papers as well as to all our favourite periodicals. So the next person who wrote the column is a good example of what's misleadingly behind the text on the page. This, for the next few years, was written by Amy Hurlston. This is the only picture I could find of her, so sorry about that. She was based in Coventry, but she used the name of Lancashire Lass. I'm guessing that was given to her by the editor of the Blackburn paper. From what I've seen in these columns, it's not particularly local. There's no sign particularly that she spent any time in Blackburn. I think she wrote this exclusively for the Blackburn paper. And she worked for women's suffrage and for rights of working women as a trades unionist. And she was one of the youngest poor law guardians in the country. And she wrote for a new woman magazine, Womanhood, and also for the Queen, the Lady, and the Gentlewoman. But you wouldn't know that from reading her column in the Blackburn paper. By the age of 24, she was a special correspondent in Ireland, reporting on the evictions for the Coventry Times. So an example of how provincial newspapers would commission special correspondents, foreign correspondents sometimes. By the age of 25, she'd written 4 or 5 novels and earned enough money from her writing to lend, in quotes, a considerable sum to her father when his watchmaking business got into trouble. At the age of 28, she was working as a social investigator, reporting on the conditions in factories for women in the Midlands, for the Women's Emancipation Union. She was widely travelled. She travelled to Russia, Switzerland, Sweden, the Netherlands. She went to Paris quite often to report on fashion for a Sheffield local weekly paper, the Sheffield Telegraph. And she, in the same way that I think tomorrow, Isabel's Idol is giving a paper about these 2 women journalists from Dundee who were sent to Asia to report on working and living conditions of women. So just another example of this kind of sort of special correspondence for a correspondence, the well-travelled provincial journalist. From 1896 to 1909, Amy Hurlston was the ladies' editor and the children's editor of the Sheffield Daily Telegraph and the Weekly Telegraph. until she married in 1909 and resigned. So again, like Lancaster, as a person, she was very pro-women. She was a feminist. She was a trade unionist, a radical liberal. But you wouldn't get that impression from what she wrote in the Blackburn paper. She wrote for a few national periodicals, such as Tinsley's magazine, but most of her writing was for provincial newspapers. Now, I've nicked this quotation from something that Ruth Livesey wrote. But in the Cornhill magazine in 1865, an anonymous writer wrote on provincialism that provincialism is the residuum which remains after the course of events has drawn the ablest local men away, and women presumably, that makes me so angry when I read something like that. But I think that there's part of us that kind of will think, well, yeah, there is a kind of meritocracy, isn't there, in careers, and the best are drawn to the centre. But and there's some truth in that, but when we think about, say, our own careers as academics, do only the best people work at Ivy League universities or at Oxbridge? Or is there is there really an alignment between ability and geography? Or our careers and families and other commitments, actually, do they make things a bit more complicated than what the Cornhill writer thought? Does provincial necessarily mean that fantastic second rate that I love so much? Does it mean mediocrity? I don't think it does necessarily, does it? And then in 1893, a third person took over the same column, which appeared on a Saturday in the paper. Using the same pseudonym, Lancashire Lass. So obviously we can't assume it's the same person using the same pseudonym when we see behind the text. But she really was a Lancashire Lass. She was from Blackburn. She probably drew the column header because she went to Blackburn School of Art. And this week's column begins with a comment on how nice it is to have one of your favourite books by your favourite authors properly bound. And in this case, she's talking about the works of Leigh Hunt. And this is Florence Garstang. That's her there with her father and her 6 siblings. This is the Leigh Hunt fan. Daughter of a Blackburn doctor. She's about 16 in this photograph, just after her mother had died. And she took on the column a few years later when she was 24. And most of what I know about her is taken from an excellent article by her great-granddaughter, Penny Bayer, based on an unpublished memoir, which I'd love to see. And we learned that Florence began her writing career just by sending an article on spec to the editor of this local paper. She was taken on as ladies' editor at £1 a week. That was less than Amy Hurlston, the previous writer, had been paid. Hurlston was a professional journalist, and Florence wasn't when she began. And she started saving her fee from writing this column, and I'm guessing from other work as well, so that she could study at Oxford, like her big brother did. And she'd saved around £200 by the time her father got into financial difficulties as a doctor and demanded that she give him all her savings to pay for her brother's college fees and some other brother's school fees and preserve the family honour to avoid him going bankrupt. And that was the end of her Oxford dream. She never went. But we wouldn't know this story, this shocking story, from her column, of course. So Florence's story tells us again that writing for provincial newspapers could be an important source of income. Also that the provincial press was a very porous print genre. It was easy to get into. It was easy to get a letter published or to write a contribution, as Florence did. You could say it was sort of culturally democratic. This ease of access often means that it's seen as a sort of training ground, a launch pad. And if you read memoirs of sort of newspaper reporters, the first chapter is often the provincial press, and then they've got that beautiful narrative art where they go up to Fleet Street. But there were loads of people that never got beyond that first chapter, and that's maybe all they wanted to do, but or they failed in their ambitions. So there are a lot of different kinds of people working or writing for the provincial press. But as we know, people like George Eliot and Branwell Bronte, they were first published in local papers. So my point from these three contributors to one ladies' column in one newspaper in one small town is that whatever your periodical interest, I do think you'll find something of value to your research in the provincial press, whether it is women writers or poetry or fiction or reviewing or historical writing or working class writing, politics, social investigation, etc., etc. Now, how did I come to write the book? It began as a history PhD dissertation. I previously worked as a journalist, mainly on local and regional newspapers, so obviously it was personal. And at the age of 45, I started a PhD. And these are some of the writers that I found helpful when I was looking at the history of newspapers, the history of reading, and for sort of some sort of theoretical backing, you know, to answer the why questions, and other people that aren't on this word cloud as well. My research question when I began was, how did the local press influence local identities in the 19th century? And this turned out to be a dead end. I just couldn't find any sort of causal link, any evidence of influence between what was written and concerning local identities in the local press and the ideas or words of readers. Because half my project was about reading the local paper and the other half was about producing the local paper. And in the reader evidence, I just couldn't find any sort of, you know, an idea arrives in the newspaper and then it sort of goes along into someone's diary or a reader's letter. It just didn't seem to work that way. Surprise, surprise. You know, it's a very crude way of thinking, but yeah, I couldn't find anything. But my time wasn't wasted. I spent months doing content analysis, mainly on microfilm. And I think immersing yourself in your chosen genre of periodical, there's just no shortcut to that. You know, you got to do it. And the benefits are just huge. You know, you can dive into that mass of print. And eventually, as if you're swimming it long enough, you get to feel the currents and, you know, you understand the weather that's going on in it to stretch the metaphor beyond breaking point. But it really pays off, you know, those hours of ploughing through your chosen genre. I learned that 19th century local newspapers, especially the weeklies, were nothing like those of today, much more magazine-y, a hybrid, as Graham Law said in that fantastic book. And lots of them had literary supplements, for example, and with much more national and international news. So after that dead end of influence and causation, my supervisor, Dave Russell, suggested looking at the places where the local newspaper was read. And so the project broadened out to how readers used the local press and to new kinds of evidence. Records of reading rooms and libraries, auctions of second-hand newspapers, newspapers in time capsules buried under foundation stones. That was one of my favourites. And I learned that reading the local news, or any newspaper in the 19th century, was very different to our experience today, where we silently read alone most of the time. It was more likely to be a group activity with most people listening while one person read aloud. So literacy was no barrier to you know, consuming the media. Readers went to specific buildings and to specific rooms in buildings to read newspapers. And I also learned that local newspapers were surprisingly popular. Another breakthrough, well, a big breakthrough came from reading this book by Graham Law, about serial fiction in local weekly newspapers, which for the 1870s and 1880s, I think Graham Law establishes very convincingly. They were the main venue through which people would meet new fiction in the UK and other parts of the world as well. And it explains why Tessa the D'Urbervilles was commissioned from the office of the Bolton Weekly Journal. And Graham Law pointed out that Tillotson, the publisher who commissioned Thomas Hardy, he saw the local press as a national network, as he pieced together sort of national syndicates made up of lots of different local papers around the country to give national publication to a new serial novel. And I thought, of course, a national made out of locals. It's both local and national at the same time. And there's other things like that. There's the National Church of England in this country is made up of local parishes. The Houses of Parliament, the House of Commons, is a national parliament made up of people representing local areas. So it's kind of not, it shouldn't be alien to us, but I think it's crucial to understanding the significance of the local press. So I felt more important because I'm now studying something of national significance, not just local. So a really key book in the PhD. Then I had another lucky break when a local historian told me about these diaries written by a Preston reporter that had been recently bought by the Lancashire Archives, the diaries of Anthony Hewitson. And when I started looking through them, they're absolute gold in all sorts of ways, but particularly for telling you about the processes of reporting and editing a local paper in the second half of the 19th century. So I used them in the PhD, and then for the book, I used 2 weeks of his diary. I sort of took 1 week in the 1860s and another in the 1880s, I think, and structured 2 chapters using the entries each day of those weeks, just to sort of look at change over time and to look at the activities of a reporter. Is this mic still working? Yeah, okay. And during my PhD, I started presenting at RSVP conferences, and I was encouraged by established scholars such as Leslie Howsam, Margaret Beetham, and Patrick Leary, who welcomed me into this wonderful scholarly community. It's a great place to grow up as a researcher, I think. And I got help from Laurel Brake and David Finkelstein and Andrew King when they asked me to write about the Provincial Press for publications that they were editing. And that pushed me, so thank you very much, that pushed me to, again, to sort of consider the Provincial Press as a national thing, to go beyond my case study towns. So, I did some extra research beyond the PhD. And so I fed that into the book. So I hope the book is much broader in scope and significance than the PhD. I published it 8 years after completing my PhD, which is quite a long time, really. I'm quite slow at all sorts of things, aren't I? Like giving Colby lectures and getting books out. That was possibly a mistake career-wise, but it made it a better book. And there's now a growing number of people working on the 19th century local press, some of whom were doing it before I was, such as Andrew Jackson, Andrew Walker, and now there's Simon Rennie and Kirsty Blair, Carol O'Reilly, Rachel Matthews, Caroline Jones, Alistair Robinson. So I'm really pleased to see that there's a fair few of us looking at this topic now. So that's how I came to write the book. Now, what the book says, so I'll try and speed through this because I'm sure every single one of you can quote passages verbatim to me by now. So each city and even small towns like Stirling were lively centres of periodical publishing. So Stirling, for example, with a population of less than 20,000 even by the end of the 19th century, but it was a county town. It produced 9 newspapers and 2 periodicals from the 1820s to 1890s. And then in my case study town of Preston, I counted more than 50 newspapers and magazines that came and went across the 19th century. And when you look at every single town, and the British Library catalogue is a great thing, and it will be again. But it doesn't have every newspaper in. And when you start looking in local libraries and archives, and I think Simon Rennie has discovered this, you find newspapers that the only copy on earth exists in that local paper, that local library somewhere. So I sort of added those up, and when you look around the country, there's just thousands of the things. And so when you look at that town by town, they start adding up. And so it's no surprise that there were more individual newspaper titles published outside London than in London. It kind of makes sense. And especially after the abolition of the newspaper taxes in the 1850s and the 1860s, you can see that steeper growth in the number of titles. So I hope you're still with me that there were more local papers than London papers, but which were more popular? Was it the local press, or was it the nationals or the London papers. This is my my favourite table. I don't think this is in the book. So just below, this is in the column when the editor replies to queries. So just below that teaser about the bit of foreign correspondence, well, it's very related Chinese foreign correspondence, which is a whole genre in itself, seeing the international in a provincial way. But below that, allegedly, the editor is replying to a query, and the answer is allegedly taken from one Saturday's sales of one newsagent's shop in a satellite town of Bury, which is a satellite town of Manchester. I hope no one from Bury is here, in the northwest of England. And lo and behold, according to the Bury Times outsells everything else. But I think that's probably true. I mean, I'm sure many of us remember, and I think was probably the same in North America as well. If you go into a newsagent, say 20 years ago, you wouldn't find the local paper in the racks with the other newspapers, because it would be on the counter next to the till in a great big pile. And everyone that went in the shop would probably take one, that day or that time of the day. And so that kind of fits with what's here. I mean, this is a fascinating table in itself when you look through all the titles, but it's basically saying the local paper sold loads more, and then you've got regional papers after that, or neighbouring areas, and so on. And if you imagine the same sort of situation, town by town, city by city, and it just adds up and builds up. And I found lots of other evidence as well of this preference for the local newspaper. From oral history, some of the early oral history was interviewing people born in the 1880s, actually. And luckily, she asked a question. This is Elizabeth Roberts at Lancaster University. Asked a question about reading matter and newspapers in your childhood home. So we get a glimpse into memories of the 1880s. And then a social investigator, Florence Bell in Middlesbrough as well. Adverts for reading rooms, they usually mention the local press. There it is for this penny reading room in Preston. Adverts for pubs would often boast about the number of newspapers that they had, as much as they would boast about the beer. And here's a pub in Liverpool. Took this picture about 10 years ago, I suppose. And landlords decided that it was worthwhile setting aside a room of their pub just for reading the newspaper, for drinking as well. So it was a big thing. It was something that would draw customers in. And in there would be the local paper preeminently. And then records of public libraries as they began to appear from the 1850s onwards. Publicly funded public libraries. So this is the Manchester Public Library. And this is mainly men, isn't it? Entirely men, I think. Reading newspapers in a public place from furniture specially designed for newspaper reading, in rooms set aside for newspaper reading. And if you look at the plans of those early libraries, as much space was set aside for periodicals and newspaper reading as it was for books. Newspapers and periodicals were equally as important. When you look at the reports there, they didn't see libraries as just automatically about books in the 19th century. And then many of these libraries would produce annual reports, and they would often list the titles of periodicals and newspapers available in their reading rooms. So I'd do some sort of number crunching in Excel with these things, and I could make the numbers come out so that local papers were dominating there as well. And no one's argued against it yet. But I hope they will. So just if you group the titles together by genre, then the local paper usually came out top, and then regional newspapers. And then another metric I used was if there's multiple copies of a title, that suggests that there's more demand for it. And again, local papers came out on top. The genre that comes through very clearly is illustrated periodicals, isn't it? With two copies of each of those illustrated periodicals at the bottom. So lots of different sources of evidence, lots of it outside the newspapers, and it all seems to be pointing in the same direction. People like to read the local paper. Why? Well, my argument was that readers responded to the exploitation, the manipulation of local patriotism, sense of place, local identity, whatever you call it. And techniques would be things like just including the name of the place in the publication. Really banal, but when you think about it, it is important. And including local visual imagery in mastheads, so that's the town crest of Preston there. And dialects, local dialect and references, as Minna was talking about this morning with the Clerkenwell News, that advert at the bottom right is just using a bit of Northern or Lancashire dialect. There's nout like Dickie's Ale. So all to give a sense of this is the, we're giving you the flavour of where you live. Football, from the 1880s onwards, there was a sort of symbiotic relationship between the local press and football, because it's about kind of local rivalries and local patriotism, and it helped both sides for the press to cover that. So local newspapers kind of sold local identity and local patriotism back to the readers. That's what they were trying to do in the texts, but did it work? So going back to the evidence from the readers, yes, I think it did. When you look at evidence, particularly from exiles, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And so this John O'Neill left behind a diary. It's fascinating when you look through the entries in the diary, they're all pretty thin about the weather or about, I don't know, a loom breaking or something at work. But the biggest entry is all Saturday when he'd go up, he'd walk a mile into Clitheroe, the nearest town, and read a newspaper, and he summarised what was in the paper, and usually international news actually, but he was reading it in a probably the Preston Guardian or another local or regional newspaper. But he was from Carlisle. He was exiled 90 miles south of Carlisle, and there's very little emotion in his diaries, but the emotion does come in when he gets a newspaper from home. It's a way of connecting with his hometown. And similarly, this exile in South Africa, writing into the local paper. And I know we can never be sure about any individual reader's letter, whether it's actually from a reader, but I think when you take them as a whole, we can be pretty sure that most of them are genuine. And that's also from my experience as a newspaper reporter myself, and sometimes dealing with letters pages. People did send in letters to newspapers, they really did. Yes, sometimes I wrote some newspapers. There's a very long road in Preston that I've just put that down as my address, and no one knows about that. But most of them were genuine. And the same point's made by Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish poet and novelist, 20th century writer. Lovely quote. This: parochialism is universal. It deals with the fundamentals. And then he says, it's not the so-called national dailies that people who emigrate use to keep in touch with their roots. In London, outside the Catholic churches, the big run is on the local Irish papers. So where you read something affects the meaning of what you read. And then something else that, it's not just the local press that does this, but I think they can do it particularly well because there's so much of it and it's in every place. It's what Morris Janovitz called the democratization of prestige, writing as a sociologist in the 1950s. So this cartoon shows the members of a mythical Sheffield boys football team who've just played a match in the afternoon, and then they've got the newspaper, the football special, Saturday evening football special, a few hours after they come off the pitch, and there's a report of what they've just played. So they're not reading the newspaper to learn anything that they didn't already know. And I think it's that James Carey makes that point really well. It's more of a ritual experience than a sort of information gathering experience, or as much as each other. But But what is going on here is that the local press is validating their lives and their achievements. I'm guessing they won. It's saying that these small things mean something, and the local press makes ordinary things special. It says it's worth recording, that our lives are worth recording, you know, in wherever we live. So that's the argument of the book. Nearly finished. So some conclusions. Is geographical place, which is one of the themes of this conference, a useful category for periodicals research? And I was looking through I actually went through and counted. Half the papers at this conference are about place as a geographical category, and half of them are using place more kind of figuratively and metaphorically to do with status and position and so on. So obviously geographical place is a big part of this conference. But yeah, how useful is it in our periodicals research? Because it's a fundamental part of our lives, and I think we can all think of places that are significant to us or almost like sacred to us, special places. So that's from a geographer, Ralph, and here's another geographer. I won't read this all out, but David Harvey's basically saying that place means ecology, it means social relations, imagination, desire, discourse, power. There must be something in there that can enrich our periodicals research. And I understand that place may be less significant for some of us and at certain times of our lives, if you're a precarious roaming academic or a digital nomad, but it's still important for most people at most times of their lives, as it was in the 19th century. I think we can agree that texts have historically specific meanings to readers, but they also have geographically specific meanings depending on where the readers are, where the text was produced, and which place it was intended for. Evidence of reading in particular places at particular times helps us to understand the periodicals that are being read. And thinking about, you know, your research agenda, the readers, the periodical or the writer that you're interested in probably also read their local newspaper. What are the implications of that? Tomorrow, I noticed that Marie Léger-Saint-Jean is talking about court reporting, and it reminded me of a recent trip to Preston Crown Court with some journalism students. And the court ushers and even one judge didn't know what rights journalism students and the public and journalists have to sit in open court to make notes. Some students were told you're not allowed to make notes in court, which is totally, the law does not say that. And a judge said that. I wasn't there at the time when they said this, but I went back and complained and sent them their guidance, which tells them the complete opposite. There's this really, really scary situation that these court staff, including a judge, didn't know the law about open justice. And it has, because they don't see reporters anymore in their courtrooms, they don't know who these people are and what they do. And it has huge implications for open justice and the legitimacy of the justice system and scrutiny. It's terrifying. You know, we made a big fuss about it, and they promised not to do it again. So we'll see. And then there's American research about news deserts, places that just don't have local media anymore. And they found that voters in those areas with no newspaper, they're less likely to vote in elections. They're more likely to have polarized political views. And their local councils have higher levels of debt because there's less scrutiny of what the councils are doing. It's just terrifying. So this is a really good time to be studying the history of what once seemed like, it's a bit like Twitter, isn't it? We just kind of thought, well, Twitter is there, it's infrastructure, it'll always be there. But then something happens or someone happens and it just disappears. And it's the same with the local press. It's become seen as essential democratic and social infrastructure and cultural infrastructure. But in the 21st century, it's just disappearing. So yeah, to sort of collect the history of it, I think is really important. What then is the place of the provincial press in the field of Victorian periodicals? So, as I said before, it's a source of income for writers and journalists of all kinds, women's as well as men. It's a training ground, a launch pad, a relatively open forum. It has an unusual geography compared to other types of periodical. It's very widespread. And that means it's a national distribution system, publication platform for advertising books, periodicals, for all sorts of content. It creates some newspaper genres, such as the Ladies' Column or the London Letter, but more often it was curating and reprocessing genres from elsewhere. And if we think in terms of media ecology, the provincial press is somewhere near the bottom of the food chain, which means that most other periodicals feed on it. So what was the place of the provincial press? Well, I think it was connected to everything, and it was ubiquitous. Thank you.
Minutes for questions.
Yeah, I went on too long, didn't I? Sorry about
that. You know, the question we've got today, brilliant talk, thank you very much. But Scotsman, a provincial newspaper.
Put that big spoon away. You're stirring it, aren't you? It depends where you're standing, doesn't it? Yeah, one person's nation is another person's region, is another person's colony or whatever. Yeah, yeah. And people in Cornwall would say the same. We're not a county; we're a nation.
So readers of the Yorkshire Evening Post.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. See, I think it depends where you're standing, really, and it depends what the newspaper itself wants to say. I think that was a unionist paper, wasn't it, the Scotsman? Yeah. So they would say, perhaps we are a provincial paper. Yeah. But the example of Scotland is interesting because I've looked at England, which is a really unusually centralised country, culturally and politically, whereas Scotland is far less centralised, particularly in terms of periodical publishing, like with 4 big centres. So yeah, an interesting comparison.
Will you repeat the question for people online? Oh, right. Will you repeat it?
Yeah, so that last question was just asking, would I consider the Scotsman, the paper published from Edinburgh, to be a provincial newspaper?
Okay.
Andrew, lovely to see your work flourishing as ever in greater ways. I wonder if you could explain or explore a bit more an area. I think you talked about it in the book, but it flashed up on your screen a bit, and it's the issue that goes around advertising. So what's very interesting about provincial press and newspapers is often that they list themselves as the Bolton Reporter and advertiser, actually indicating something significant about that as part of the newspaper's makeup. So I wonder if you could perhaps tell us a bit more about the role, therefore, of advertising in a provincial space, both as a placemaker and maybe as identity formation, but also about the whole business of the press, which clearly is significant in a small space where you're trying to also carve out a living in a place where readership is not millions or 100,000. Yeah, could you explore that a bit further?
I will try, yes. So David was asking, where do adverts fit into the provincial press? Yeah, is that a fair?
Yeah, it's in the title.
Fair pricing.
Really is important.
Yeah, yeah. That many newspaper titles call themselves advertisers as a subtitle. But it's a neglected area. Advertising is a neglected area. I think we all need to do more on it. It was great that I keep referring to Minna's paper, but it was really good this morning about the Clerkenwell News, and I like the way that she was really doing close reading of the adverts. Andrew King forced me to look at the business side of newspapers much more in a book chapter a couple of years ago, and yeah, so local papers were businesses. They wanted their town to flourish. They wanted their business to flourish, but it would flourish only if other businesses flourished. So they were very much part of that business community in their town or city. You say, well, yeah, small readerships in each town, how can they make money? But they could be very, very profitable local papers. When you look at the sums paid for them when they change hands, I think that the Preston Guardian changed hands in 1858 for £5,000, which would be more than £1 million in today's money, for a paper that, yeah, it covered most of North Lancashire, but hugely profitable. Because when you start counting the adverts and you look at the ad rates, yeah, it's really, really profitable. But in terms of local flavour, it kind of, because it's being advertised locally, it kind of automatically gives a local flavour to it. I think local newspapers, they're almost just like a carrier bag with local written on the side. And you can put anything into that bag and it becomes local. I mean, that's what that sort of curation and editing of material from elsewhere is about. So if you just put an advert into the local paper and it becomes a local advert with a local flavour. Advertising a local business, using local dialects, mentions a local street name. It all just sort of keeps, I think, reinforcing that idea that this is where we live. There's the name of our town in print. There's a tripe seller's shop in print, sort of thing. I think it just adds to that, yeah, democratization of prestige. So answer it.
Well, let's thank Andrew again.
Thank you.